Most keying and compositing tutorials take way too long, so I want to do a fast beginner tutorial on just those things. Let's get started right now. Here's my shot with a nice, well, not perfectly evenly lit green screen, but good enough. Let's use the key light effect in After Effects and just drag and drop that onto our shot. Then where you see screen color, select that eyedropper and find the brightest part of the green screen you can, which looks to be around his head. Then just select that, and we'll see we already have a pretty decent key. Instead of final result, let's switch that to screen matte and we can actually see what's going on here. All these black spots on his clothing and on his face mean that we're keying out a little bit more than we should, and these white spots on the wall, the green screen back here, mean that we're not keying out enough. So we have to adjust these settings. The best way to do that is to jump into the Screen Matte tab, just toggle that arrow down, and we're going to play with the clip black and clip white values. I'm going to start by dragging the clip white value down, and I'm going to bring it down until we start to see a little bit more of his clothing and his face. And then I'm going to bring the clip black values up until we're removing that key up top. And that actually did a really good job there. Now we do have a couple of these little splotches here that we couldn't quite get around, but we do have some tools to help us fill in these holes. We can use the Screen D-Spot White and the Screen D-Spot Black. So for Screen D-Spot Black, let's try 1. And already that removes quite a bit. Let's just bump it up to 2. And we're pretty much there. Now if we have any white dots outside of our key, like we have a couple here, maybe a couple other places, that's where we can use the Screen D-Spot White. Just put in a factor of 1 and those white dots are gone. Now this edge, this key edge here looks really crunchy. We're gonna fix that in a different effect. So instead of Screen Matte, let's switch to Final Result. And you'll see that the colors look just a little too posterized and crunchy and terrible here. That's because we're doing a little more processing in key light than we actually want to be doing. So instead of Final Result, let's switch that to Intermediate Result. Now we did bring back a lot of this green. The green screen is super reflective because it's very bright, and our subject here is picking up a lot of that. But we're going to remove that using a couple different effects that come with After Effects. Now just to make sure that our key is really clean, we can toggle these green, red, and blue dots down here and just switch to alpha. And we are seeing a very, very nice key. Let's switch back to RGB, and now let's work on getting that nice clean edge. It's especially noticeable in the hair here. We're pretty much removing all of the nice fine strands of hair, and we want to see if we can bring those back. My favorite way of doing that is using the Refine Soft Matte effect. Let's drag that right there onto our footage clip. Let it process for a second, and instantly we are seeing these really fine hairs that somehow that effect brought back. It really is magical. We still have a little bit of this green spill, and After Effects has a very powerful, very useful tool called Advanced Spill Suppressor. We'll drag that underneath our Refined Soft Matte, and suddenly all that green spill is completely gone. So if we zoom out, there we have a decent key. The next step is just to garbage matte out this unnecessary whatever nonsense in the corner here. So I'm just gonna mask it out and switch that mask to subtract. And to preview everything a little bit faster, I'll switch from full resolution down to quarter. And we just want to make sure our mask doesn't cut off our subject at any point, which here it's cutting off the gun a little bit. So let's just adjust the mask to be a little bit wider and compensate for that. Maybe here as well. The next step I want to do is composite this onto some footage. So let's go ahead and import our backplate. Anytime you're compositing footage onto other footage, it's nice to have your frame rates match. So in your project panel, you can see your frame rates. Both of mine read 23.976 here, but if they didn't, you can always interpret one of them by right-clicking on it, going to Interpret Footage, selecting Main, and where it says Conform Frame Rate, enter the desired frame rate to match the rest of your composition. Ordinarily, this isn't going to be a problem if you're shooting both your backplate and your foreground, but if you're using a stock backplate like we are, then you may have to adjust that. Let's go ahead and just drag our backplate underneath our footage. So right away, we can see a couple obvious issues. The most obvious one to me is the direction of our lighting. Our actor here has the lighting coming in from the left. That yellow light is representative of the sunlight, whereas our desert plate here, the sun is coming from the hard right, so they're the exact opposite. I like the direction my actor is facing, so I want to flip this desert shot around. So I'm going to select my desert, hit S for scale. These parameters represent the X and Y, and I want to flip it horizontally. So instead of 100, I'm going to do -100, making sure to break this chain here. So I'm only adjusting the X parameter. And now I have flipped my desert shot around and the lighting is getting a lot closer to matching. If I solo my desert shot, we're going to notice something. The camera is moving here, which means we either have to remove all of the movement from this shot or we have to track this shot. I actually like this movement, it gives it a little extra realism, so we need to track this shot. It's actually extremely easy to do in After Effects. Now there's very little parallax. This is a 3D camera movement technically, but it's so little we can track any of these background features. However, it's always good practice to try and track elements that are close in proximity to where you're trying to composite stuff. That way there's going to be zero drift. So my subject is a foreground element, he's very close to camera, so I'm going to track some of these rocks because they are fairly close to camera. Because I adjusted this scale parameter, I'm going to go ahead and right click and pre-compose and move all attributes into the new composition. Now if I hit S for scale, we'll see it's just 100, 100 instead of -100, 100, which would mess with a couple things. With our back plate selected, we can go to Window, Tracker, or if your tracker window's already open, go ahead and find it and select Track Motion. You can zoom in with the middle mouse key and just move your tracker around and grab these corners to scale it up a little bit. And I think I'll just track this rock right here. Now there's no zooming and it looks like there's no rotation in this shot, so I'm not going to worry about rotation and scale. But if you did have some zooming and rotation, then you will need to track a separate object, which we have plenty to choose from, but since I don't need to worry about that, I'm not going to waste any time. And while I wait for that track to finish, I'm going to go ahead and visit FootageCrate.com, where we have tons of incredible visual effects, music, 3D assets, and a ton more. I'm actually going to be using a couple of these visual effects here today, the aerial dust bursts, and I want to use some of these muzzle flashes because our boy here is shooting a gun, and we need to add a little extra realism to that shot. Now that our tracking is done, we need to apply it to something to save that tracking data and parent other layers to it. I always like to use a null object for that, so go to Layer, New, and Null Object. And then with our null object layer selected, hit enter, and let's go ahead and rename this Tracking Data. And then over in our tracking window here, select Edit Target and choose Tracking Data, hit OK, and apply. Hit OK one more time. And now our null is tracked into the scene. Let's get back to that first frame and unsolo these layers. Let's go ahead and pre-compose our green screen shot. And I'll just call this foreground subject. To speed things up a bit, I'm going to go ahead and export this layer here. That way we're not processing all of these king effects as we're working. So File, Export, add to render queue. Under format here, instead of H.264, we want to choose QuickTime. Apple ProRes 444 works for me. And instead of RGB, we want RGBA. We want this transparent area back here. We want to make sure we capture that. Depth, I think million of colors is fine. We can actually double check our layer. So instead of millions of colors, we want trillions of colors. So we're not actually losing any data since that's what our original footage has. So back in the render queue, where it says depth, choose trillions of colors. Just match original footage if you're trying to avoid any quality loss. Then hit OK and go ahead and export that. Once that's exported, let's go ahead and import it. And then simply drag and drop that into the same pre-composition as our keyed footage. And we could just disable our green screen key shot. Don't delete it though, that way if we ever need to come back and make changes to our key, we still have it there. This is a non-destructive workflow. Let's go ahead and jump back into our main composition now. Select your foreground subject, and then over by parent and link, select the pick whip and drag that onto your tracking data. And now if we play things back, we should see that our foreground subject is tracked into the scene. And he is. We are seeing he's getting cut off here at the bottom a little bit, but that's okay. We'll fix that in due time. The next step I want to do, since we're on to tracking, is more of the positioning elements. Right now we can see the bottom of the ground here, which would imply our subject is maybe only 4 feet tall or so. It doesn't look quite right, and that's because our perspective is off. What we need to do is find the horizon line of both our subject, our foreground element here, and our backplate, this desert. Let's start with the desert. I think that's going to be a little bit easier. I'm going to select the desert layer and solo it. And then with no layer selected, I'm going to hit G. And that's going to bring up this pen tool here. So how do we find the horizon line? The horizon line is always eye level. Even if you're looking up or looking down, it's going to be the same height as your eye, or if you're taking a photo or a video, it's going to be the same height as your camera. So what we have to do is determine what is the height of the camera and then put a line right there. That line is just going to be a reference line, of course, but we need to see it. That way we can match it up when we're trying to find the horizon line for our subject. So we can try and guess. I personally would guess the horizon line's maybe just right around here, but luckily we actually have this guy right here. And if we open up our desert backplate, I'm gonna just move this forward. And as he gets closer, we get a really good idea of how high off the ground the camera actually is. We can't see the top of his four-wheeler, so we actually know we're gonna be shorter than it is. I would guess the horizon line is maybe just somewhere right around here. So I'm just gonna go ahead and draw a line right where I think that horizon line is. I'm guessing the camera is sitting just about this height. Now, if you have a bunch of straight lines in your scene, you can determine the exact horizon line, finding the intersection points of those lines, but we don't have them in our scene, so we have to do a little bit of guesswork. But you can always use logic. Just like I said before, we can't really see the top of this vehicle, so we can safely assume that we're below it. Also, just trust your gut. It's very clear that we're not eye level with this guy, so the camera has to be below where he is. So I'm gonna guess, yeah, the horizon line for our backplate is right around there. I'll rename this layer Horizon Line Desert. And then I just want to make sure my backplate starts where it did before. So I'll use the left bracket to make sure the start point is correct again. And then I'll copy this horizon line and delete it from this composition, just so I can copy and paste it into my main comp. Next, let's find the horizon line for our subject. I'm going to isolate his layer. Let's actually jump into that pre-comp. All right, so this is a little bit trickier, but we can use the same principles. Where he's raising the gun, we're seeing underneath his arm, so we know we have to be underneath his arm. We're not seeing the top of his arm, so we know the camera's sitting underneath. My guess is that the camera is actually sitting pretty low and it's tilted upwards. Remember, no matter what the tilt is of the camera, whether it's tilted up or down, the horizon line is the exact same. The horizon line is going to be exactly whatever the height of the camera is. So if I'm looking at this, I think the camera's tilted up, and just trying to use some of these bullet casings to maybe help distinguish what we're seeing the top and bottom of. I'm gonna go ahead and guess that the horizon line is right around here. And I can hit V and use my selection tool to just straighten up that line a little bit. Now you do have wiggle room with people and organic subjects, but you still wanna get it as close as possible. And I'm guessing that that is the horizon line. So again, I'm gonna rename this layer Subject Horizon Line, copy that, delete it out of the pre-comp, jump back to my main comp and paste it in. Then let's unsolo these layers and we can see how drastically off these two horizon lines are. Actually, for the subject horizon line, I'm going to change the color to be red just so we can see a clear difference between the two. Now, what do we do? Do we move the subject up or do we move the backplate down? Well, really, that is up to you. I like the subject where he is, so I'm going to move the backplate down. So I'm going to take the horizon line for the desert and I'm going to whip it to my desert backplate. That way, when I move the backplate around, its horizon line follows. So I'm going to go ahead and move my desert backplate down until this horizon line matches our subject horizon line. So making sure the horizon line of the desert is parented to our desert backplate, and the tracking data we also want to parent to our backplate. Remember, these rocks that we use for tracking in this knoll are going to be moved down, so we want that knoll to move down as well. Now let's go ahead and move our backplate down. We have an issue that when we move it down, our subject is moving as well. So for our subject, let's go ahead and untrack it from the tracking data. And now we can move the composition down freely until those lines match up. Then make sure to reparent your foreground subject to the tracking data. And now we just need to create a patch for this sky. There are a million ways to fix this. I think I'll just do the hackiest possible way. So I'm going to duplicate my desert backplate layer, and let's just solo this. And I'm going to hit Q, which is going to give me the shape layer selection tool, and I'm just going to mask around the sky here. And then I'm going to hit Y and move this anchor point up to the sky. And then I'm going to hit S for scale and unlink the X and Y, and let's just increase the Y scale. Now let's unsolo that so you can see what we're doing a little more clearly. Let's just move the sky duplicate up. You can see we've kind of created this hacky little patch. Now I love doing things as quickly and as hacky as possible, as long as it's not super noticeable. Everybody's working on some time constraint. Don't be afraid to pull out all the stops. Let me know in the comments how you would approach this fix. I'm just gonna feather it out a little bit. Let's see if that gives us what we need. Let's make sure we're not feathering off the top at all. I'm surprised that that worked, but hey, here we are. So now our perspective matches, our footage is tracked in, and our sky patch is all set. Let's go ahead and disable our horizon lines for now. We don't need to see them. All right, now that we got our positioning and tracking and general lighting direction all set, we need to do coloring. These clips are actually looking half decent, but not as good as they can be either. Get very comfortable with the curves effect. This is going to be one of your favorite effects ever. Over by the effects and presets window, go ahead and type in curves and drop that onto your foreground subject. As a general rule, I always try and match the subject that I have keyed onto the backplate and not the other way around. We're not going to work to make this desert shot match his colors. We're going to work to make his colors match the desert shot. To get a quick overview, find the Show Channels and Management setting button down here and just toggle through the red, the green, and the blue channels. It gives you a nice overview of what may need to be done. For me, the red is the most obvious. He looks way too exposed, especially in the red channel. I'll switch back to RGB, and for now, let's mess with the curves. The curves is great because it's just a nice visual representation of the luminance values and the colors inside of your shot. So you can control the midtones by creating points and moving it up and down. You can create contrast by raising up the highlights, which will dip the shadows down. You can even manage the darks and the highlights. And you can even switch channels. So if we want reds and we want to take out a lot of red from the midtones, we can just drop it all the way down. And obviously that looks horrible, but that's essentially how the curves effect works. I'm going to hit reset and let's get started. We need our foreground subject to match the coloring of our background. We are compositing this guy onto that plate. We don't want to try and match the backplate to our subject. Now, while the lighting direction is looking good, the color, the contrast, everything is just slightly off. I like to start with the shadows. Luckily, we have a couple good reference points here. The mountains create some really nice dark shadows, but even better than those are this guy on this four-wheeler driving up right now. Let's go ahead and jump into our desert backplate composition. And just temporarily, I'm gonna drag this footage over until he gets as close to camera as he's gonna get. And here you can see we have some nice shadows that we can pull some data from. Back in our main composition, move our subject to the side and we'll reset it later. So I'll just move it off to the left so you can see both the subject and this guy in the background here. One of the most underused tabs inside of After Effects has to be the Info tab. If you go up to Window, you can find Info, and it's such a simple tab, but it's extremely useful. You'll notice it has the RGBA values, and if I just move over any pixel, you'll see that those values are changing. So I want to pull some information from these shadows here. Looks like we're at about 0.03, 0.04, and 0.03 for the red, green, and blue channels. Let's look at our shadows on our subject. 0.003, so we are way darker. We need to bring up the darkest points of our subject to match the dark points of our vehicle back here. So we want about 0.06, 0.07, 0.06 would be ideal. So with our foreground subject selected, let's go ahead and jump into curves, and I'm just gonna bring up this bottom point a little bit until we start bringing a little bit of brightness into those shadows. If I toggle over it, we're at now 0.03, so I can keep going a little bit further. 0.05, 0.05, it's looking pretty good. So it looks like there's a little more green than blue or red. So let's jump into our green channel and we can increase that a little bit as well. We'll toggle over it again, 0.05, 0.07, 0.05. And yeah, that's pretty close to what we're getting down here. If I zoom out, you can already see that we're starting to look a lot better. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and reset the position of my foreground subject and jump back into my desert backplate. And let's just line this shot up again so it starts at the right endpoint. Let's do a little more curves action. So with my foreground subject selected, instead of green, let's do the RGB. And let's just bring these midtones down. Let's just darken up our guy a bit more. Maybe pull a little bit of the highlights down too. And it really is just a matter of finessing and messing with these parameters until you get it to look pretty believable and pretty accurate. That already looks a lot better to me. Here's before and here's after. Much cleaner, much more believable. Let's play with the colors next. This yellow is pretty accurate. The sun is coming from the left and it does have a yellow tone to it, but this seems way too extreme to me. I'm gonna add the hue and saturation effect. This is a great effect. You can control the master saturation and lightness, but you can also edit the individual colors. I'm gonna select the yellows for now, and just so I can see what yellow tones we are adjusting, I'm gonna max out the saturation. It's gonna look super ugly, but you can see we're gonna be touching on all of the sunlight. We might edit a little bit of these bullets as well, but for the most part, I think we're good to go ahead and maybe tweak these parameters a little bit so we're not editing so much of the red. And now we can start to desaturate it. Let's bring it down until it looks a little bit more like the sunlight hitting these rocks. And again, it's just a matter of tweaking these parameters, messing with them until you're capturing all the hues you want to be editing. One fun thing about this is you can also play with the overall lightness of it. So if you need to expose it up a bit or bring it down, you have that control. Maybe bring the lightness up slightly. That lets us increase the overall contrast. I think I removed a little too much of the saturation here. Unfortunately, we are starting to lose some of the bullets. Maybe I can isolate them a little bit more. But overall, this is looking pretty good. It's a good habit to always jump through your red, green, and blue channels just to see if there's anything sticking out. So the red channel still looks a little overexposed in his face to me. The green channel and blue channel both look pretty good. So back in red, let's jump into our RGB settings and let's find our reds in the hue and saturation. Again, let's max them out. And yeah, it seems already pretty isolated to his face, but maybe we can take out a little bit of this yellow because he's just looking a little too sunburnt right now. And then let's start desaturating it, bring it down. And then we can also bring the lightness down a little bit, see if we can add a little extra contrast to his face. And again, just play with these settings until it looks right. Maybe I want a little more blue in his face because let's say the sky would be reflecting off of his forehead. So let's bump up the saturation so we can see what we're doing here. We can actually mess with the red hue itself. So if I circle around, obviously it's a pretty unbelievable effect right now, but just slight tweaks in either direction can really help you close in on the exact look you were going for. Maybe actually giving him a little more yellow would be a little more realistic, as if there's light bouncing off of the ground here. And then I want to desaturate it again. And then maybe on top of all of this, let's do another curves effect. And let's just increase the contrast by dipping down these midtones and just giving it a nice little S-curve. The next thing I want to do is focus on adding a little depth of field to our back plate here. If we zoom into our subject, we can see that his hand and the gun are actually out of focus while his face is pretty much in focus. That's a very shallow depth of field. While if we look at the desert backplate, the mountains and even the sand all seem to be pretty much in focus. Now we can't really add focus to this element if we wanted to sharpen this up. There's no real good way of doing that, but we can add a little depth of field and actually make these mountains seem like they are out of focus. A very quick way of doing that is just going to be creating a new solid. So I'm going to hit Control Y, and I actually want both the width and height to be just a bit bigger than my frame. So let's just do 5,000 by 3,000, and we can always scale it up later if this isn't enough. And then over by my effects and presets window, let's just type in gradient ramp and drag that onto our white solid. And then I'm going to move the start of my ramp down by just dragging this Y parameter down. And I'll do the opposite for the end of ramp for the white controls. Let's just bring those up a little bit. Then I can just hit T for opacity, and let's just bring the opacity of my Y layer down. So I actually want this line, this divide between the black and white, to be right here on the ground. So let's just bring these down until those dots are right above the ground. So that transition happens right around there. And then I can bring my opacity back up to 100%. And let's just parent this gradient ramp layer to our tracking data. And I can actually just rename this layer to gradient ramp. And I could turn off the visibility for now. And now let's create a new adjustment layer. Control-Alt-Y. And I'm going to add the camera lens blur effect. Then with the camera lens blur selected, I can find layer, and let's add the gradient ramp that we just created. Now we actually want to make sure to put this adjustment layer underneath our foreground subject so we're not blurring out our subject. So make sure to have that gradient ramp under the layer and effects and masks instead of just the source. Now if I bring up the blur, we can see we are blurring the bottom but not the top. The default makes the white blurry and the black in focus. You can either click swap colors on your gradient ramp effect here, or on your adjustment layer with the camera lens blur effect, you can also select the invert blur map. Now that blur does look a little extreme to me, so I'm going to bring it back down. And I might adjust my gradient ramp so this middle gray here is a little bit softer and a little bit larger, and the white and black aren't connecting so harshly. So I'll just bring my white a little bit down. And that should make the transition of the blur just a little bit softer. And that's looking pretty good to me. Now this effect is a bit of a render hog, so for now I'm just going to rename and disable my adjustment layer, camera, lens, blur, and disable it. And I just want to make sure I re-enable it again later before I render anything out. And I can always do that by just tapping on this eyeball here. So again, without the depth of field that we added and with the depth of field. And just to clarify, the reason our gradient ramp effect is larger than our composition is because it is tracked into the scene. And we want to make sure that if our tracking brought the layer over, we would never see this hard edge. So I just scaled it up a bit. The last thing I want to do is just add some visual effects to make the gun feel like it's really being fired. I'm just going to drop my preview resolution down to 1/4 for now. And then I just want to find all the moments that he fires his gun. I believe there are 3 of them here. So here's one, and I'm just going to add a marker by hitting the little asterisk button on my numpad. The last step is just going to be adding some muzzle flashes and some smoke from FootageCrate.com. There are both pro and free options, so anybody can make a scene just like this. These aerial smoke bursts are by far my favorite smoke effects for doing muzzle flashes. They have a lot of energy to them, and they were shot practically, so it's real smoke, and it doesn't look digital at all. So I'll just download a couple of these. And then I just need some muzzle flashes. Really, any of these will work, but I always default to these Muzzle Flash Magnums. I don't know why, but they just always end up looking perfect when I use them. Once they're all downloaded, go ahead and import them into your After Effects project. Once you have your effects imported, just navigate back to your first marker right here, and I'm going to drag in one of these muzzle flash clips, and then just hit the left bracket to align my layer to the playhead. You can see this muzzle flash looks a little off. All we need to do is change the blending mode. I can go into blending modes later if you want. Just let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see a video on that. I'll change it to screen, and we can see that it blends a whole lot better with the scene. Let's scale up our muzzle flash a little bit by just hitting S for scale and dragging that up. And then here's a nice little trick for adding more effects and just kind of stealing the parameters from this layer. I'm going to select my muzzle flash layer and hit Ctrl D, which creates a duplicate. And then while holding Alt, I'm going to select one of these smoke burst effects from my project window. And still while holding Alt, I'm going to drag it over this clone of my muzzle flash. And that just pops in this smoke layer exactly where my muzzle flash is, with the same position, scale, rotation, and even blending mode parameters that we had previously selected. And then I could just extend it out a little bit. Now, one thing I forgot to do is to parent these to our track layer, so I'm going to do that now. And now they will move appropriately in the scene. To give muzzle flashes a little extra pop, it could be fun to ramp up the exposure right when the muzzle flash goes off. Or I'll do it the old school way. I'm just going to create a white solid, and I'll name it Flash. And then I'll change the blending mode to Soft Light. And then I'll trim it down so it lasts just 1 frame long, and then I can repeat these steps for the other 2 markers. And then I could just select everything by hitting Ctrl A, pre-composing it. I'll just call this Compositing tutorial. Now, remember, we were working with 4K, but our final is going to be 1080. So I'm going to hit Control-K to bring up my composition settings, and let's just change this to 1920 by 1080. And now I can scale my pre-comp down, even adjust the position slightly if I want. I mostly want to make sure that the bottom of his body here, which is getting cut off, isn't cut off anymore. I could do a little reframing to make it more dramatic, maybe scale it up slightly. Overall, I'm happy with this. I think we are ready to export. Thanks everybody, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you want to see more beginner-friendly compositing tutorials and visual effects tutorials, let us know in the comments below. And if you want to support us, go ahead and check out ProductionCrate.com, where we have loads of visual effects, 3D models, music, and more. That's it for today. Later, creators.